Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture of the Distinguished Visiting Professors online series. I'm Professor Choi Kwok Tong, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Education and Human Development. This time, we are privileged to have Professor James Spillane with us for his lecture, Educational Policy and Teaching Practice, Engaging the Challenge of Educational System Building. Professor James Spillane is the Spencer T. and Anne W. Olin Professor in Learning and Organizational Change at the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. He is also the Professor of Human Development and Social Policy, Professor of Learning Sciences, Professor of Management and Organizations, and Faculty Associate at Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research. Professor Spillane has published extensively on issues of education policy, policy implementation, school reform, and school leadership. His work explores the policy implementation process at the state, district, school, and classroom levels, focusing on intergovernmental and policy practice relations. He also studies organizational leadership and change, conceptualizing organizational leadership as a distributed practice. Today, he will share his perspectives on building educational systems to support implementation, institutionalization, and instructional innovation. He will also discuss the opportunities and challenges of educational system building during the COVID. I'm very much looking forward to his presentation, and I am sure you will find his lecture both enlightening and inspirational. Let's welcome Professor Spillane.
Hello. Thank you, Dean Troy, for the invitation. It is a great honor indeed to give this lecture at the Education University of Hong Kong. My talk today focuses on education policy, and in particular, the challenges of implementing educational policy. I focus on a particular type of policy, that is, policies that focus on improving the quality of teaching. Teaching is, after all, the core work of schools and school systems. And over the last half century, there have been dramatic efforts by governments around the world to make policy about teaching in order to improve its quality and at the same time address inequities in students' opportunities to learn in school. Many of the ideas that have found their way into these policies are associated with what has become known as the cognitive revolution. Starting in the 1950s and 60s, a whole body of research fundamentally changed our understanding of how people learn. Several recent reports by the National Academies in the United States, for example, have looked at this literature and extracted some of the key findings. We use a variety of words to talk about the learning involved, such as deep learning, authentic disciplinary learning, and at the same time, learning that engages and uses the cultural resources that different students bring to the learning situation. At the same time, over 30 or 40 years, we've had something of a revolution on research on teaching. Scholars have deepened our understanding of the nature of teaching as a practice, and also the different sorts of knowledge and expertise that teachers need to teach. We talk about disciplinary knowledge, pedagogical disciplinary knowledge, and so on. One important part of this work, for example, has been focused on developing culturally responsive teaching or instruction. That is teaching that takes into account, rather than ignores, the resources that students from different ethnic, racial, social backgrounds bring to the learning situation. These ideas are ambitious and go against much of what happens in most classrooms. They will involve, if they are to be realized in classroom practice, a fundamental shift in the sort of teaching that we now see in many classrooms. Specifically, they will require changes to the academic tasks that children engage in, and at the same time, the discourse that teachers and students, among themselves, engage in around these tasks. Now, while these ideas may be self-evident to those of us in the education field, they are not or will not be self-executing. They face a very familiar problem. While these ideas have found their way into policy discourses, to use Stephen Ball's term, and have become pretty much mainstays in policy texts, and of course also found their way into policy technologies such as new curriculum, new student assessments, and other learning activities, they face the hurdle of implementation. If the goal is for these ideas to permeate most classrooms, most schools, that is what we mean by change at scale after all, then we really have to seriously engage with the challenge of implementation and institutionalization. Implementation simply refers to putting these ideals about teaching and learning into practice inside schools and inside classrooms. The more difficult challenge is the challenge what my colleague Jeanette Kalivas calls the challenge of institutionalization. It is one thing to get ideas into practice, but as we all know, often ideas get picked up, used by teachers and school leaders for a year or two maybe, and then disappear once the supports for the reform efforts are no longer there. The challenge of institutionalization is ensuring that these ideals about teaching and learning become permanent, become ingrained and taken for granted in the everyday practices of teaching and learning in schools and classrooms. That's the challenge of institutionalization, how to make things self-reproducing when the initial supports for their implementation have disappeared. Before we go on, I want to talk about 4 dimensions of scale, that is, change at scale. Very often change is just taken up by a few schools or by a handful of teachers, and it never gets to scale. My colleagues Cynthia Coburn and Jeanette Kalivas have written extensively about the challenge of scale, and they identify 4 dimensions. The first, we're all familiar with, has to do with the spread of ideas. Ideas often spread. A new curriculum, a new approach to teaching reading comprehension, a new strategy for teaching mathematics for understanding or for engaging students with the scientific process. Lots of teachers pick it up. That's spread. But very often what we find is that as the ideas spread, teachers and school leaders' implementation of the ideas are very much at the surface level. They adopt the new curriculum, but change the strategies in ways that fit with their existing ways of teaching. This is what I mean by the spirit of the reform. Really, what's critical here is helping people understand not just the surface level changes in teaching, but the more fundamental, deep changes that's involved in the sort of teaching and learning envisioned by many new policies. This is what I mean by spirit. The spirit of the reform as distinct from the letter of the law or the letter of the reform. The third dimension is stake. It refers to basically what's critical for change at scale is that local teachers and school leaders develop a stake in the reform, a sense of ownership for it. It becomes theirs. This is critical for implementation and institutionalization. And finally, to use Jeanette Kalivas' word, stick. This is at the core of institutionalization. Do these ideas stay for the long haul? Or do they disappear after a year or two once the implementation efforts have stopped? Now, very often when you read the literature, we offer a couple of explanations for why policy fails. Often we point to the design of the policy texts and the technologies themselves. They are somehow flawed. They did not support teachers learning about the new ideas so that they could implement them in ways that reflected the intent. The other dominant explanation in the literature has to do with the motivation and the capability of classroom teachers and school leaders. They lacked the will. They did not want to change. They wanted to keep teaching the way they'd been teaching for a long time. Change, after all, brings about uncertainty, and we do not like uncertainty. Or even if they were motivated to change, very often we report that teachers lack the knowledge and skill, the capability, to teach in new ways. For example, they often do not have the understanding of science or mathematics as a disciplinary process that would require them to teach students, children, about these disciplinary processes. My talk today, I want to argue that while policy may fail for these reasons, that there is a more fundamental reason why policy often fails. And if we are serious about change at scale, we need to engage this issue. It has to do not with simply individuals or policy texts and technologies. It is fundamentally relational. It is about the interactions among the actors in the school system, teachers, school leaders, and indeed system leaders and other stakeholders. It's relational. And as we know, relations, interactions among people fundamentally depend on structures. And what I'm going to argue today is that if we're serious about ensuring change at scale, transforming teaching, we need to engage with education system building, and in particular, think seriously about the role of educational infrastructure in supporting implementation and institutionalization of new ideas about teaching and learning. A quick preview of my talk. I'm going to begin by telling you about one school system that I studied over 7 or 8 years in the United States. And I'm going to talk about their efforts to build an educational infrastructure to support a fundamental change in the teaching of mathematics at the primary school level. I want to show you how that infrastructure supported interactions among teachers, school leaders, and system leaders over several years as they went about putting this new curriculum into practice. And I want to talk a little bit about evidence of the effects. Based on that case study, I'm going to extract some key lessons that I will argue are critical when it comes to building educational systems that support policy implementation and institutionalization, and indeed support instructional innovation more broadly. And I will conclude by considering how might we think about this work in the time of COVID. For the last year, the pandemic has fundamentally transformed all of our lives, including the lives of children and teachers and school leaders. So I would be remiss without spending a little time on considering the challenges, but also the opportunities for educational system building in the time of COVID. So let's begin with a case study of educational system building, and I'm going to take you to a school system called Auburn Park in Nebraska in the United States. This is a local school district. It has 14 elementary schools. But when you think about educational systems, I would like you to think broadly. They take many different forms, including in the United States. There are charter school networks. There are religious-based systems, such as Catholic diocesan systems. There are systems such as International Baccalaureate, Montessori. And systems take different forms around the world. Some are national education systems, such as Ireland. Others are organized around provinces. So it's important that even though I'm talking about one particular system, that you think broadly as I talk about this system and envision how these ideas might play out in systems that look different. A quick word on methods. I'm not going to talk long. This is a case study. It's a case study of educational system building based on the work in Auburn Park. It involved mixed methods. We did annual surveys of teachers in the system. And we also selected a purposeful sample of schools and a purposeful sample of teachers and school leaders within those schools for interview. Let's begin with what Auburn Park did. System leaders, the mathematics leadership committee for the school system, decided that it was time for a new curriculum. And after lots of deliberation and considerable disagreement, the committee, which was made up of teacher representatives from each elementary or primary school and chaired by the system's director of curriculum, decided on a new inquiry-based curriculum for teaching elementary primary school mathematics. The curriculum is called Investigations. But the school system and the committee did not stop there. They began to build an infrastructure around this curriculum. They developed new student assessments for each grade level. They also actually, for each unit in the curriculum, created pacing charts, lesson plans, and a variety of other supports for teachers. They created a system-wide data dashboard where all student data could be accessed by teachers and school leaders. They invested in teacher-leader professional development. The curriculum director worked with each principal to select a teacher from each school who they thought would make a good teacher leader for mathematics. And then they paid for this teacher to take the equivalent of a master's in mathematics, mathematics teaching, leadership, and child development that was specially developed by a local university. They created teacher leader positions in the school. When these teachers completed their professional development, they became either part-time teacher leaders in that they worked full-time, but also did leadership for mathematics on the side, or they became full-time teacher leaders or half-time teacher leaders and were given the title of a mathematics coach. They also created routines or reappropriated existing routines, both at the system level and at the school level. At the system level, these routines included the Math Leadership Committee that had selected the curriculum. Now this committee became a place where teacher leaders and representatives from each building worked together to think about how can we make sure that this curriculum is getting implemented? How can we support teachers? What are the challenges they're facing? And at the school level, they created routines such as professional learning communities at each grade level, which met weekly, as well as they continued the grade level team meetings. Now, this is what I mean by an educational infrastructure. And it's at the very core of building education systems. We can think about it as, when we think about infrastructure, we often just think about physical infrastructure, which is a good image to have, because the power of thinking about system infrastructure is that it's near at hand, yet it's invisible. We don't even notice it. It's only when something goes wrong that we begin to wonder, well, why did the water not heat this morning? But when I think about infrastructure, I think about more than just the physical infrastructure. I think about the structures and resources that systems and schools mobilize to enable improvement, to support teaching, to enable improvement in teaching, and to maintain its quality. And it includes, as we saw in the case of Auburn Park, it includes curriculum and student assessments, the instruments of instruction, if you will. And it also includes the formal positions, routines, and procedures at both the system and school level that inform teaching and learning. But it's more than about things. It's also fundamentally about norms. How should we do things here? About values, what sort of learning is valued? How do we generate knowledge about teaching? Is it something we bring in from outside, or is it something that we value teachers as creators of knowledge? This is a way I have of representing educational infrastructure. You have to look carefully because the various pieces are woven together in ways that we don't often think about them. We don't go into school on a Monday and ask, what are our norms here? Or what are our values typically? So how did this infrastructure work in practice in Auburn Park? One of the ways I would like you to think about the Auburn Park education system, or any education system for that matter, is that it is made up of different communities of practice. We can think about system leaders as a community of practice. We can think about coaches and teacher leaders as a community of practice. We can think of teachers and students as a community of practice. And we can think of school leaders and principals and assistant principals as a community of practice. The challenge, however, for implementing new reforms about teaching and institutionalizing them has to do with the boundary practices that connect these different communities of practice. And that is really, really critical, to improvement efforts. How do we cultivate interactions in these boundary practices that support teaching, that support the implementation and the institutionalization of new ideas? And I want to argue with you that what the routines, such as the professional learning community routine at the school level, the Math Leadership Committee at the system level, what these routines did is they created boundary practices that supported the implementation and eventual institutionalization of a new approach to teaching mathematics in Auburn Park. Let's look at the evidence together. The big claim is that educational infrastructure created these boundary practices and maintained them, and it provided boundary objects around which people participating in these boundary practices negotiated their understanding of the reform ideals and what they meant for their actual teaching. Further, the system prepared and mobilized boundary spanners to support the work of teachers and school leaders in these boundary practices. Let's begin with an example, and this is Jody, a special education teacher, who's talking about the Math Leadership Committee. And notice how she describes it as an important boundary practice. We're given a lot of training in the committee that we're expected to bring back to the buildings. And so we hear about a lot of things. I think that deepens the understanding, the kind of light bulb goes off. Two things that are important here. Jody is talking about spread. We're given a lot of ideas that we take back to the buildings, spread. But also, listen, she says that deepens the understanding. She's also talking about the spirit of the reform. It's not a surface level understanding. They're constantly talking in order to develop their understanding about these ideas. Clarissa here is talking about boundary practices also in the Math Leadership Committee. She's pointing out that one of her colleagues, Gabriella, is on this system level leadership routine. So she has all the expertise and ideas that she brings back and shares with them. And the site for that sharing is the professional learning community at her grade level that both Clarissa and Gabriella are part of. Again, a boundary practice in the professional learning community at the grade level, but also the important role of Gabriella as a boundary spanner between the system level and the grade level. So here I just want to pull out for you these two important boundary practices. The Math Leadership Committee created a boundary practice between system level leaders and school-based coaches and teacher leaders. At the same time, the professional learning community created a boundary practice between coaches and teacher leaders and teachers and students. And here, of course, with the support of teacher leaders. Here is Rachel, who's a kindergarten teacher, and she's talking about how they plan both in team meetings and in professional learning communities as a team. They plan about how to implement the curriculum, about how they're going to teach this particular unit, about whether it worked or not and how they might modify it. But what's important here is that Rachel points out that in that planning, their coach is available, the teacher leader is available. And if they have questions, the coach is there to support them, to offer suggestions, to raise questions, to help them figure out what might be a way of teaching this particular unit that it reflects the spirit of the curriculum. Let us look at a little quantitative data here. This is a teacher leader coach in this school. As you can already see, this teacher is already a pretty central leader in her school prior to getting the professional development and to becoming the coach, math coach for the building. But look at what happens a year later when she is a full-time coach. She becomes the go-to person for advice and information about mathematics. You see here teachers across, lots of teachers across different grade levels turning to this person for advice and information about mathematics. She's a central advice giver within her school. And this pattern persists across time. Not only do we see more people in this school year, 2011-12, but we also begin to see the development of triadic relationships around this coach. In other words, it's not just a lot of pairs or dyads interacting with one another. We begin to see triads beginning to form, and triadic relationships are very important in organizations as they're the basis for informal influence. What's important here is to see not only the central role of the coach in supporting the implementation of the new curriculum, but to begin to appreciate how the spread of information and ideas across time in this particular building. Now, we've talked about boundary practices, we've talked about boundary spanners, but it's very important not to ignore the critical role of boundary objects. One boundary object in this system was the new curriculum. And what's important about a boundary object is that people participating in a community of practice, such as a professional learning community, they negotiate understanding, they negotiate meaning with one another using boundary objects. Just remember, every teacher was teaching the same curriculum and pretty much teaching the same units at the same time. So they were encountering similar challenges, or maybe they had different challenges and one person had a way of addressing it or had developed a way of addressing it. Here we see Andrea talking about how the new curriculum is so different and wondering early on, what's the purpose of this classroom activity? They don't kind of make sense to me. But what Andrea points out is the fact that her colleagues were using the same curriculum, provided an opportunity for her to develop her understanding using the curriculum to focus their interactions. Another very important boundary object in Auburn Park were student assessments. Teachers double graded student assessments, responses, and this became an important boundary object in that teachers talked about negotiating their understandings of the curriculum around students' actually responses in the assessment. Carmen, a fifth grade teacher, talks about wondering if a particular response was appropriate for a fifth grader in mathematics. And sometimes she's not convinced, but then one of her colleagues in the professional learning community will point out to her, but they did this and this. And Carmen said, I hadn't thought about that. They use the vocabulary well, for example. And Carmen begins to understand what might be a good answer for a mathematical problem. Indeed, teachers talked about not only their understanding of student thinking about mathematics, but also their understanding of their own pedagogical approaches, and indeed, in some cases, that their understanding of mathematics as a discipline improved by virtue of these interactions. Boundary objects were critical to these negotiations and interactions. Very often, school systems build educational infrastructures and deploy them, and the story ends there. What's critical about the Auburn Park story is that both system leaders and school leaders supported the use of the educational infrastructure across time. In other words, they supported the infrastructure in practice. Here is Georgia principal talking about how her role in the implementation of the curriculum, her role in the professional learning community routines has changed over time. She talks about early on being very involved, participating in professional learning communities in her building to make sure they were working, to make sure that teachers were actually talking about mathematics. But over time, she began to withdraw as she saw these communities working better. In other words, she began to observe that teachers were doing just fine without her. Not in every case, of course. Some principals talked, for example, about being strategic in that there were some grade levels where the professional learning community routine was not working, where teachers were not seriously engaging about mathematics. And in those cases, they strategically decided to remain involved in an effort to improve the quality of the interactions about mathematics among teachers. What's important here when we think about what Georgia says, she says, they develop their own agendas. They have ownership. And this is that third dimension of scale that I mentioned, a stake. What we hear here is that Georgia is talking about how teachers in her building began to develop a sense of ownership for this curriculum and for its implementation. They developed a stake in the reforms. Before we move, I just want to make very clear that I've given you some examples of, based on the qualitative data, but we observe these patterns across the school system. For example, teacher leaders, people who became teacher leaders who still work teaching full-time but did this on the side, they became more central advice givers on average, moving from just over four teachers going to them for advice and information to 6, a significant increase. And for those teacher leaders, the math coaches who became full-time leaders, they moved from an average of 6 teachers going to them for advice to 16. This is, again, a significant increase. The other thing we notice is that, excuse me, the other thing we notice here is that there was a dramatic increase in brokering across the school system. By brokering, we mean you might come to me for advice about something and I say, I don't really know about that, but you should go and talk to so-and-so. That's brokering. And it's very important in organizations, especially when it comes to the development of new knowledge and understanding. And what we see here is that there was not only an increase in teacher leaders brokering and math coaches brokering, but there was an increase in brokering for everybody, including classroom teachers, though the increase was much more dramatic for teacher leaders and math coaches. How did system leaders bring about these changes? It involved two key mechanisms. I think too often in education, we juxtapose bureaucratic control against more collegial commitment arrangements. I think the reality is different, and Auburn Park brings that to the fore. Yes, the system used bureaucratic control. They said to teachers, you will participate weekly in a community of practice, professional learning communities. They did not have a choice. They told teachers also that each week had to be devoted to a different topic, mathematics one week, English language arts another week. At the same time, they also used the collegial mechanism. Remember, the system level committee was made up primarily of teachers from each primary school or elementary school in the system. So they had both, yes, you have to do this, but you can decide how to organize your meeting. Yes, it's on mathematics, but you can decide what's an important topic for today. So I think it's very important when we think about system building, when we think about building educational infrastructures to support teaching, that we think not just about bureaucratic or collegial mechanisms, but instead we think that these mechanisms work interdependently. They work together. And what's called for depends in part on where a system is in the change process, but also what particular aspect of the work we're talking about. A quick word about change here is that we did document, and this is a paper you can read, I'm not going to go into the statistics, but we documented, on average, teachers developed more inquiry-oriented beliefs about teaching mathematics over the 4 or 5 years that we studied them. Not all teachers, but the majority. I use that as evidence of stick, if you will. So I've told you the story of Auburn Park. What lessons might we take from it? I think when it comes to designing educational infrastructures to support not only the implementation and institutionalization of instructional reforms or instructional policies, but also instructional innovation more broadly, there are several things we need to take into account. One, it has to be anchored in a taken a shared vision for instruction. If people in the system have lots and lots of different visions about what teaching is and what sort of teaching is important and what kids need to learn, then it is very difficult to design, deploy, and support an educational infrastructure to support teaching and its improvement. I think educational infrastructure has to engage both the official curriculum and the actual enacted curriculum. Very often we build supports that are all about the official curriculum or a new curriculum, for example. But in Auburn Park, that's not what we observed. Yes, the infrastructure supported work on the official new investigations curriculum, but it also supported interactions that were very much grounded in teachers' struggles and efforts to enact that curriculum in their practice. It has to allow for the development of shared knowledge about teaching among people. And here, by people, I don't just mean school teachers and school leaders, I also mean system leaders. The exchanges were not just coming from the system level down through the various boundary practices. Boundary spanners were also taking ideas that they heard from teachers in their schools, that they heard in interactions among teachers in the professional learning community routines. They were taking those ideas back up to the system. And they were saying to their colleagues on the Math Leadership Committee, what can we do about this? What are you doing in your school? Can we brainstorm together for a way that we might adapt this particular unit so that it works better? Very important that it cultivates trust and interactions among staff and stakeholders. Absent trust, people are not going to talk openly about their struggles with implementing a new curriculum. It allows for experimentation and innovation. Teachers try things out, report it back, got advice, got other suggestions through their interactions with colleagues in professional learning communities, etc. And the educational infrastructure has to enable, allow for ongoing evaluation and improvement. Is this infrastructure really working? Why is it not working? Are there parts of the curriculum that are not working very well? How might we adapt them so they work better? And finally, of critical importance, it's not good enough to design and deploy an educational infrastructure. System and school leaders have to work to support that infrastructure in use. Otherwise, it's likely to fade away, or teachers will engage, but not really engage in ways that enable improvement and innovation in teaching across time. When we think about educational infrastructure and improving teaching, I think it's also important that we think about not any one or two components of an infrastructure. For example, in the case of Auburn Park, it would be very easy to just focus on a new curriculum, teacher leaders, but that misses the point. We really have to think about all the components, and more importantly, how these components work together in interaction inside schools. Too often in education, we're looking for that simple panacea. It's curriculum, it's teacher leaders, it's coaching, or whatever else. I want to argue that that's not the mindset that will work. What we need to think about is the various components of infrastructure and figuring out how they can work in interaction. We need to think about multiple levels simultaneously. Focusing on any one level is problematic. And we saw that in the case of Auburn Park, where it went from the system to the school to the grade level. That's a difficult challenge, but an important one. And finally, we also have to think about not just about curriculum and routines, but also about rules and regulations, the normative aspect, and of course, the cultural cognitive dimensions. None of these things, curriculum is not value-free. It foregrounds a certain set of values about what it means to know mathematics and backgrounds others. We need to embrace and acknowledge the normative, the value aspect, and of course, the rule aspect of this work. It would be strange not to say something about COVID and doing the work of education system building in the time of COVID. I would like to offer some comments, and I do so in the spirit of stimulating discussion rather than offering key findings or ideas. One thing, of course, we might wonder about is networking in the time of COVID. And when I talk to educators around the world, I hear certain things, especially when you're proposing, let's talk about improving teaching. And there's quite a bit of pushback saying, you know what, right now, we can't do that. We have so many other things that we need to engage with, including that our staff and students are safe. Another thing I think that, so there's limited time for teachers to engage with one another because of all the challenges that the pandemic has brought. There is some evidence to suggest that in times of crisis, for example, that we tend to favor close ties. It may have to do with the insecurity and uncertainty that the virus has brought. And of course, in doing so, we ignore weak ties, which can be very important. And there's also, of course, a lot of our interactions have been done virtually. And there is a challenge, I think, of building trust without in-person interactions, especially building trust with people that we had not known previously. So one of the questions I ask you is, how can we reframe these challenges as opportunities for building networks to support teaching and instructional innovation? Acknowledge them, but then reframe them as opportunities. The disruption, I think, that was caused by COVID and the pandemic around the world also offers us some possibilities. One thing that I hear from people in many countries is that it underscored for them the need for people to work together, to do joint work, and to acknowledge the importance of distributed expertise. Because no one person, actually very few people, had the expertise to deal with this pandemic. So they had to work together to figure out how to deal with it. I think in some respects, it has also affirmed the power of networking beyond the schoolhouse or even the school system. People reached out to others beyond their networks. And perhaps that is something that we can continue to do post-pandemic. It has also very much, I think, in many schools, underscored the importance of networking with families and the immediate community. And finally, I think in all of this, I think we may be learning to appreciate the value of weak ties. Weak ties are people we may only interact with once, or maybe we interact with them once a year or a couple of times a year. We don't know them very well. Trust is not really critical here. But weak ties can be critical because they give us access to information or ideas that can help us figure out how to address particular issues. So how can we use these opportunities to cultivate virtual communities of practice to support teaching and instructional innovation? I think virtual networks have some advantages. They reduce the cost in terms of travel and time by virtue of the fact that they take us beyond our school or our school system. They reduce the risk of groupthink because they give us access to ideas and ways of thinking that go beyond the people we hang out with, engage with all the time. There is a possibility, I think, for more inclusiveness in terms of participants, although that will depend in part on access to technology for people. And accordingly, there's the potential to reduce inequities in access to ideas and information for teachers and school leaders in education systems. I think in particular, for example, small rural schools here that may not have access to the same wealth of ideas and information. Virtual networks creates huge possibilities there. So the question I guess I have for you is, how do boundary practices, boundary spanners, and boundary objects work similarly and differently in virtual networks compared to face-to-face networks? There are some challenges in developing and maintaining virtual networks. Nonverbal cues, as you all know, are difficult to notice in virtual online exchanges. It's easier for people to be passive participants, turn off the camera, do their own thing. Not all virtual spaces, of course, are equal. So when we think of virtual spaces, it's important to think of all the different platforms. We might all be thinking about Zoom right now, but there's a whole host of other platforms that have different affordances and constraints, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So we need to think, when we think about virtual spaces, we need to think of what do each of these different ways of networking add. One thing I want to point out here is that there's some very interesting research that vicarious participation in virtual networks has advantages. So it's not all about people being active participants. People notice things when they just participate vicariously that can be very important. And there's some very interesting literature on this in the business sector. I think most importantly, perhaps we need to get beyond virtual versus face-to-face networks. And that for me poses, how can we combine face-to-face and virtual networking in ways that cultivate and channel relationships essential for supporting teaching and enabling instructional innovation? How can we think about these spaces working together rather than either or? So in conclusion, implementation and institutionalization takes a system. Educational system building involves building infrastructures that create and maintain boundary practices that bring different communities of practice together, that provide boundary objects around which people can deliberate and negotiate what these new ideas mean for teaching and learning. And they also develop and mobilize boundary spanners to support interactions among participants in these boundary practices. The challenge always with infrastructure is that, unlike the Pompidou and the Marais in Paris, infrastructure is typically hidden from view. We don't notice it, we take it for granted. So the challenge we face as we begin to ask questions about the educational infrastructure in our school systems and schools is, what is it? How is it working? But I think it's possible. Thank you very, very much. I look forward to the questions, and there's lots of more information at distributedleadership.org. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jim. Very interesting lecture, full of ideas and insights. And I was particularly pleased to see so much of it based on empirical research. So thank you. I'm Alan Walker, and I have the pleasure of chairing a brief Q&A session around Jim's talk. Our esteemed panel will be asked to comment briefly on the talk and also invited to pose or to ask a question if there's anything or any clarification they'd like from Jim. But first, let me introduce our panel for today. First of all, Dr. Anissa Chan. Dr. Chan is the founding chairperson of the Hong Kong Principals Institute and former principal of 2 secondary schools in Hong Kong. She's also been involved in policy formation and wide-scale curriculum reviews in Hong Kong. Welcome, Anissa. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Also welcome to Dr. Darren Bryant. Darren is head of department of the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership at EdUHK. And before he slipped into the academic stream, he was a teacher and a school leader in Hong Kong schools. So thank you for your involvement, Darren. We appreciate it. The third member is Dr. Kian Haiyan. Haiyan is the director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Leadership and Change here at our university. She has a deep knowledge of education and education leadership in China. So welcome, Haiyan. It'll be great to get your perspectives as well. So without further ado, may I invite Anissa to perhaps give us a little comment and to pose a question for Jim. Anissa.
All right, thank you, Alan. And thank you, Jim, for sharing your empirical research on the educational infrastructure on a very interesting project. Well, that resonates with my a couple of projects that I have done with my school for about 10 years now. But I've been using a self-organizing school, self-organizing theory to build school capacity to improve student learning outcomes and also student personal qualities through a set of coherent and deliberate strategies through structural, cultural, and relational pathways. But I use 3 organizational concepts, which are a purpose, process, and sustainability. Now, the purpose is that we established clear targets, vision, explicit and clear targets, and in one of the projects, the targets, the objectives are even set up with all the stakeholders, including parents and students. So that gives us a drive to move things forward. And we provided with a set of committed resources like technology, manpower, coaches, and also timetabling arrangements. The process itself is with a deliberate and coherent strategies and design. It involves what in your research, the terminology of spread, spirit, and stick. It means it involves the scaling up, the depth of understanding, and also the ownership by all the stakeholders concerned. The teachers and students, and in one of the projects, even the parents are involved in it. The teachers, well, the leadership is involved in it, but through distributed leadership. The teachers are, well, maybe you call it spanners in your project. The teachers here, we have formal and informal leaders. They collaborate and they co-teach, and they are the trainers. They are being trained, and they facilitate, and also they take part in building up the lesson repertory, and also observe each other and help to spread ideas. And even the students are assigned particular role in the lesson. In the lesson, they are not just they are collaborator. I mean, they are even collaborator in one of the projects, and they are even the main character in the projects involving improving student personal qualities. They are even the main character in that particular project. and parents as well. So they speak common language. So it's a wide, it's extensive spread. So and an extensive stake in that they own the very project. So I think it speaks a lot of resonance with my project in a couple of projects that I've done for nearly 10 years. And the technology plays quite an important role. The technology helps sustain capacity in the whole project. The technology provides the tool to build lesson plans. In that, it build lesson plans where teachers and students alike can give their immediate feedback. They can know the teachers themselves, they help and modify and improve on the lesson using the technology platform, and also the tool and also the teacher's appraisal. We also use built-in, right? We will build in the teacher's appraisal for teachers at various level of hierarchy. They are expected to exhibit and demonstrate different capabilities in their teaching performance. So that's enable the kind of the depth of understanding, the scaling up, the ownership, and it itself also makes sure that it the stickiness, the sustainability, because all this is deliberate and coherent design and strategies built in the whole thing. Now, the very one question that I would like Jim to perhaps on your project, and well, as well as shedding light on the couple of projects I've done, is I think sustainability is very important. Sustainability is the hardest. So I'm thinking about how to sustain, how to make stickiness. There are two components to it, is stickiness over time. How do we ensure, how to keep the fire going, the passion of the innovation, without losing the spirit, without losing the understanding, or even better, for a perpetual improvement. So the stickiness over time, perpetual improvement, how is that sustainability? How is sustainability capacity built into project? This is one aspect. Another aspect is sustainability, not just over one item, but for organization. How to ensure perpetual renewal, perpetual drive for new initiative. So sustainability of, sustainability of passion.
Thank you very much, Anissa. Jim, a brief comment on the sustainability.
Thank you, Anissa, and it's very nice to see you again. I remember the talk a few years ago at the Principal Institute. I think you raise a key issue. I think often we think about the sustainability of a single initiative, like improving mathematics or improving English language arts or some other subject area. And what I think you have beautifully captured is, how can we think about sustainability not just around any one instructional improvement initiative, but think about how do we build organizations, how do we build systems that sustain themselves. And in some respects, this is what I was trying to get at when I was talking about not just implementation and institutionalization, but how do we support ongoing innovation within a school system or within a school? And in some respects, I think the answer, the best answer I have is that we really need to think about how do we build educational infrastructures that embed ongoing innovation, not that we're changing things all the time, but that we're thinking of ways that will improve the implementation of a curriculum, not 1, 2, 3 years out, but 5, 6, 7 years out. So when I think about sustainability with respect to the talk, I'm trying to think about how do we create these structures, what I call educational infrastructures, that actually do the work of sustainability. And I think many of the items that I outlined with respect to the components of infrastructure, both at the system and the school level, are key to that. For me, the sustainability issue is really very much at the core of educational infrastructure design, deployment in a system.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yeah, an important issue indeed. We might move now to Darren if we can, and he may take that a little bit further and tie some other issues in it. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jim. I'm really enjoying this. I have a couple questions for you just around the notion of contextualization. So what happens when you take the concept of infrastructure as you studied it in the Auburn Park district and then try to move it somewhere else like Hong Kong? So for example, from my understanding of your talk, in Auburn Park, part of the success seems to be this strong top-down mandate with also some autonomy from below. So for instance, you've got the mandate of doing mathematics reform, the mandate of a coach being selected in schools, but the schools have some autonomy to choose who the coach is and what topics they want to discuss. So that seems fine. In Hong Kong, of course, we have some policies that are really mandated and some that maybe are encouraged and not exactly mandated so strongly. But we have lots of variation in autonomy in schools. Very few schools are directly managed by the government. Some are almost like private schools. We have some that are similar to charter schools in the US. So there's huge variation in autonomy amongst schools that are all delivering the same curriculum. So here's the question then. So how essential is this concept of mandate with maybe a narrower amount of autonomy like we might see in Auburn Park for this infrastructure concept to work?
Great question, Darren. I think, this is a story about schools and school systems. And as you know, the history of American education is that most decisions with respect to teaching and learning and curriculum up until maybe 30 years ago were left to the individual school. That has changed dramatically. Those schools still maintain a lot of decision-making, I think. Systems vary. We have a system like Auburn Park where the school district or school system has exercised more influence with respect to the adoption of curriculum. They operate in a state that was the last in the United States to adopt state standards and state accountability, which is important. So they have operated as an independent system for a long time with respect to curriculum and teaching. At the same time, I think, if you look at how the decision was made with respect to what curriculum was adopted, it was not the superintendent or the curriculum director saying, here is the curriculum. It involved a committee of teachers, representatives from each building. I think that was strategic. And in many respects, it may be relatively unusual within the US. But that, even though it was a mandate from the center, from the system, I think the decision had quite a bit of authority for teachers in that it was made by a committee of teachers, of their representatives. So yes, the central mandate was important here. As one teacher put it, we're mandated to meet every week, and smiled as she delivered that. But at the same time, there was what I call in opposition to the mandate, or not in opposition, but together with the mandate, you had this commitment strategy. I think in order to think about infrastructure, we can think of infrastructure operating at the school level, and you can think of a lot of independent schools, I'm sure many that you've studied, that build their own infrastructures because they operate pretty much independently of any system. At the same time, we can think of schools that belong to systems that have a variety of arrangements. And when I think about a school, or actually I prefer to say education system, I would think of everything from the likes of Auburn Park to International Baccalaureate, to Montessori, to a national school system like the Irish Ministry of Education. And clearly, I think the how responsibility and authority is distributed between the system and the schools will differ between those. Hence, I think the blend of bureaucratic control or mandates and the blend of a commitment strategy shifts depending on the particular system. And I think when we think about building educational infrastructure, it's very, very important that we don't say, oh, here is one size, we need to fit it into every school and every system. I think we need to take into account the different characteristics, the different standard operating procedures of the school systems we're talking, are the schools we're talking about. So I think that's important.
I think that's very important, and great question about contextualization, Darren, and what we need to be considering in Hong Kong with that. We can tell your knowledge of Jim's work through the question, so thank you for that. And thank you, Jim. I'd just like to move on to Kian Haiyan now, if she'd like to ask a question around her area of interest. Haiyan, please.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you, James. And I think I'm always fascinated by this concept of infrastructure. And actually, I have borrowed your concept of infrastructure in one of my GRF proposal. And in that proposal, I try to examine the relationship between leadership, infrastructure, and system-wide improvement strategies adopted in mainland China. And actually, this grant has got $500,000 funding, and Jim is one of the co-investigators. Thank you, Jim. And I'm interested in this concept because, as you have said, infrastructure is always invisible, taken for granted, particularly for those within the system. So if I take a bit detached approach, and if I try to decode infrastructure in China, if there's really system-wide improvement, and if there is instructional improvement, I think I can see a lot of the infrastructures that really creates and sustains boundary practices, and also prepares and mobilizes boundary spanners in the system of mainland China. For example, if we use your concept of boundary spanners, there are some system-nominated full-time boundary spanners, a bit like coach in the United States, but in the Chinese system, we call them teacher research officers, 教研员. So these people, their role is to spread and span practices across schools. They may go to visit schools, visit different classrooms, and they will collect some good practices and then spread them across the district level. Or sometimes when there is new curriculum, when there is new textbooks, their job is to try to examine and conduct research about this new curriculum, textbooks, and then they will model teaching and all this. There are a lot of boundary practices of these teaching research officers. And also within school, I can also see some school level boundary spanners, because in the Chinese system, we have different titles for those teacher leaders. We call them backbone teachers, we call them famous teachers, we call them subject leaders. And they are sort of like, they also spread and span practices from classroom to classroom as a schools. And sometimes we may also make them take some extra responsibility to try to mentor or try to expand their knowledge across schools. So there are a lot of boundary practices in our system. Then also, as you have mentioned, all these boundary practices cannot be understood or examined separately. There are different components of the infrastructure which interact and enable this kind of instructional improvements. There are, if we also unravel a bit about this infrastructure, I can see there are all those different components, such as there is a mechanism to distinguish and identify those teacher leaders. And also there is a career ladder in the system that will give those teachers or make them become more influential. And also there are also policy priorities which try to encourage schools become clusters, encourage schools become networks for resource sharing. So there are all these different components, but I think the difficult part is always to try to understand how these different components really interact in reality. And it's I have to say it can be very complex. So the question is that compared with Hong Kong, definitely in mainland China, there seems to be a more centralized policy structure, and there are more strategically planned networks. So a bit relevant to Darren's question. So is that kind of centralized big picture structure always a precondition for this kind of change at scale?
Thank you, Haiyan. And I think you've pointed out several very important things. One is, I think the US is catching up with a lot of Asian countries with respect, including China and Japan, with respect to, you know, the image of teaching in the US, as you know, and until recently, or at least 30 years ago recently, it was the individual teacher working alone as a solo practitioner. And I think we've borrowed a lot from China and other Asian countries with respect to thinking about master teachers, thinking about teachers who are master practitioners. And I think that's important. I think, again, to go back, I mean, the Auburn Park story, which is a story of the central office of the system working with schools to build an infrastructure. Yes, the system is critical in that, and the system saying, here is the vision for instruction that we think is important. Now, that vision wasn't fully worked out. It was a curriculum, it was a set of ideals about blending principled and procedural knowledge in the teaching of mathematics. But at the same time, one could imagine, to go back to my response to Darren, one could imagine an independent school building a similar infrastructure. But if we're talking about the infrastructure operating at the system and the schools that are part of that system, then I think it is really critical that the system takes an active role in helping teachers and schools come to some agreement about taking a shared vision for instruction, because it's very, very difficult to build an infrastructure to support teaching, to support building knowledge about teaching, if everybody is working from very, very different visions of what kids should learn, how they develop, and how they grow. So I guess my answer to you is, yes, the system has to take some leadership. And I don't think it's going to happen. Even Auburn Park is just 14 elementary schools. If everybody was working on their same vision of instruction, it would be very, very difficult to create, deploy, and maintain and support the use of an infrastructure across these schools.
Thank you very much, Jim. We've had three great questions. The time just absolutely flew by. We had one about sustainability from Anissa based on her experience. one about contextualization from Darren, and then one about contextualization and boundary standing from Diane. Of course, our audience will have their own questions and issues, and we encourage those to think about them. But for now, Jim's given a long talk. Now he's sat through the questioning. So I think we've had enough. Thank you very much, Jim. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate your input. Thank you to the panel. Anissa, thank you. Darren, well done. Diane, well done. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I would like to thank Professor Spearing for his fantastic presentation. I also want to thank the panelists, Professor Walker, Dr. Chen, Dr. Bryan, and Dr. Chin for their insightful remarks and discussion. As Professor Spearing argues, infrastructure is typically hidden from view. So the challenge we face as we begin to ask questions about the educational infrastructures in our school system and schools is, what is it and how is it working? Above all, I hope this lecture will help you think about designing educational infrastructures to support instructional innovation. The next lecture will be held in June. In it, we will welcome Professor Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford University to discuss the recent breakthroughs in knowledge about learning and development and the implications these have for school designs and teaching practice, as well as for educator preparation and development. Stay with us. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.